Hello, all. Thank you for joining us on this wonderful day of student presentations and a celebration of all the wonderful projects that Polygence students and alumni have done. I am really excited to present with our wonderful guest speaker today, Dr. Irena Smith, whose wonderful bio I will read in just a moment. But I want to give people, as I know that these last sessions may be running a little long, 1 or 2 more minutes to join us so that we can begin the conversation with a quorum in this room. So just 1 or 2 moments more, and then we'll kick things off. Great. Without much further ado, let's begin. I am Dr. G.P. Laborde, the head of strategic initiatives at Polygence, a one-time mentor and a constantly humbled educator here on the team. I am so impressed with the poise and precociousness and really appetite for affecting change in the world that I've seen through all student presentations today. This panel is called Showcasing Research on Your College Applications, the moment where you take all of the great work that you've done through your projects with your mentors and translate that into a story that tells something about you, who you are now, and who you aspire to be once you get to college. I can think of no better person to have with us to talk about how to do that wonderful act of translation than Dr. Irena Smith. I'll introduce her, and then I have 1 or 2 questions to begin the conversation, but this panel is really designed for you, the students and your parents, to ask the burning questions that you have about the college application process directly to an expert. So please start entering your questions anytime in the Q&A, and I will share them in due course as we proceed with the conversation. To introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Irena Smith founded her college consulting practice 15 years ago now, drawing on her experience as an admissions officer at Stanford University, where she read and reviewed thousands of applications over 4 years. Now she helps students find and celebrate their best stories as they navigate the application process. Her goal is to give students a sense of control over what can be an overwhelming and frustrating process. And most importantly, she encourages them to think long and hard about who they are, what matters to them, and what they bring to the table as they embark on the journey from high school to college. Irena has a BA in English from UCLA and a PhD in comparative literature, also from UCLA, where she received a Distinguished Teaching Assistant Award and a dissertation year fellowship. We all know, as our wonderful co-founder Jin shows us, that comparative literature PhDs are amongst the best people to talk to for these translative efforts. So Irena, we are so happy to have you. Thank you for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and maybe share any trends that you've noticed this year through the application process?
Sure. And first of all, thank you so much for including me. I just learned about Polygence not too long ago, and to my sorrow, I didn't learn about it earlier, but I am so, like you, humbled and impressed, and really just, again, deeply impressed by the effort and the creativity that the students have put into their presentations. My own journey into admissions actually started with stories, first as a lifelong omnivorous reader, then as an English major, which I just have to have a side note is not dead, then as a comparative literature graduate student, then as a lecturer actually in Stanford structured liberal education program, and then an admissions officer, and finally an admissions counselor, and actually now an author, which is a whole other separate story. I think I've been thinking a lot about trends in admissions, and I think fundamentally, we can talk about trends which mostly consist of which colleges are admitting fewer students, which seems to be increasingly more and more of them. But I think fundamentally the trend is that it's more than ever the same as it used to be, which is all colleges are looking for curious, aspiring, questing people who are authentically curious and curious in a way that goes beyond their GPA or the number of APs they've taken, but show initiative in pursuing their specific curiosities, no matter how niche or unusual those interests and curiosities may be. So I think that the trend has always been and continues to be to find students who are authentic and who are interested and interesting. And one of the things I really love about Polygence is that it allows students to do exactly that.
Thank you. This connects with something I know has been an important watchword for Stanford admissions for a long time, and was probably one of the core criteria that you thought about during your time there. This idea of intellectual vitality, which is a broader term basically meant to identify curiosity beyond the classroom. Could you talk to us more about that and how you used to think about intellectual vitality when reading applications for Stanford, and how you think about presenting that now as you work with students on applications?
Right. So the institutional history of the word intellectual vitality is actually curious. And apparently the term comes from my former structured liberal education co-lecturer, John Ryder, who not only lectured in SLE, but was also a senior admissions director at Stanford and was the one who pulled me out of SLE and into admissions pretty much for the past, I guess, 20 plus years of my life. And the idea of intellectual vitality is exactly what you said, a curiosity that goes beyond the classroom, where the student shows initiative in pursuing what they are most interested in. So sort of their deepest, most authentic interests. In the reader handbook in the admissions office, one of my favorite phrases was, there are many ways to quantify intellectual vitality. And the phrase that specifically sticks out in my head is, it oozes from the file. And oozes means it can, it's a little bit of a weird verb, but it means it could come across in teacher letters of recommendation because the student asks creative and interesting questions, seeks out other resources, engages with the classroom material and the teacher in ways that go above and beyond what the classroom covers, but also may manifest itself in independent research. And that might be because a student is very interested in a biological phenomenon or is interested in 19th century women's clothing of the middle class and what it had to say about social conditions in rural America or, big cities in Europe, or about translating from Mandarin into English and what is lost in translation. And when I read applications for Stanford, which was the late 90s, early aughts, students mostly, from what I could tell, were sort of finding these opportunities in an ad hoc way. I don't think something like Polygence existed yet. And so when I was looking at all of the projects that students have done and are currently doing, it simply blew me away that there are now resources that would help support that. One of the things that Dr. Laborde and I spoke about offline earlier is, where was Polygence when we were in high school? Because there were several areas of deep interest for both of us that simply we did not know how to begin exploring when we were in high school. And essentially, as an admissions officer, you would look for it again in teacher letters of recommendation. You would look for it in the Stanford specific essay of what project experience, et cetera, made you excited about learning. But it could also come across in the personal statement. It could also come across in a list of favorite readings, podcasts, museums, other cultural experiences. And I think ultimately it has to do with how a student makes a narrative from what they're deeply interested in.
I really appreciate that tour, not only through the history of the term, but also for such a vivid additional word, oozing with intellectual vitality. There is some sort of special sauce that I think, as you say, has to come from an authentic place from students. It's not something that can be faked. And so that's one of our hopes too, is whether it's something that gets you into Stanford or gets you into the other colleges that you wish to attend, finding something that's truly authentic to you is what we're all trying to help students embrace. This is perhaps a fun game to play now, and then we can get into the questions that are beginning to roll in. We were talking beforehand about there not being this opportunity for us. And I was telling Dr. Smith, I grew up in rural Maine with very supportive parents, but with not much access to things outside of my high school. And so the game I like to play with people who are past high school and college is, what would your Polygence project have been? So Dr. Smith, can I invite you to tell us?
Absolutely. So mine was a little bit of a niche project in that my family and I emigrated from the former Soviet Union back when there was a Soviet Union, and my native language is Russian. And one of my favorite books in the entire world is Mikhail Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita, which, if you don't know it, please go track it down and read it, even in actually one of the many very good contemporary translations. At the time that I was in high school, there were only two translations. One was from a heavily censored Soviet version, and one was from an uncensored version that was stylistically, I felt, in my arrogant 16-year-old way, really lacking. And so I decided, with all the arrogance that 16-year-olds occasionally possess, or I certainly did, that I would translate The Master and Margarita. And I limped through the first chapter, came to the second chapter, which is stylistically very different, and hit a brick wall and realized this translation is just in general a much more difficult thing than simply knowing English and knowing Russian. And when I got to college, I was fortunate enough to find a mentor who was probably one, or not probably, but absolutely the greatest translator of his generation, Michael Hyam. And through a series of many different fortuitous coincidences, he became my mentor and one of my dissertation advisors in graduate school. But it wasn't until my freshman year in college, when he and I happened to cross paths, that I started learning about what is translation. There's an art to it. There are conceptual ideas in The Master and Margarita that I had no idea how to render in English. And just the theory of translation in general was so fascinating. So that would have been my Polygence project, is, maybe translation philosophically as a larger concept, but also the problems of translation specifically in a book that is set in Moscow in 1937.
Wow. And I could see why that's also, given your family history, personally meaningful to you. I think that some of my favorite student projects today are ones that stem from something that's personally meaningful to them, whether it's a family member who's been affected by an issue that they want to explore, or something that students themselves want to have an impact in the world going forward. Thank you for sharing that. I will say, as a brief digression, one of my great early intellectual accomplishments in college was writing a 40-page paper for my Italian major in Italian on Arnaud Daniel's brief interlude in Dante's Divine Comedy. From 160,000 lines of poetry, there are only 6 that are not in Italian, and those are from this, spoken in the voice of Arnaud Daniel, who's a French Provençal troubadour poet that Dante particularly admired. So those issues of translation, though I didn't go perhaps as deep as you did, I definitely gained a deep appreciation for that kind of act from a writer in that project. I think that my Polygence project would have been completely different than my field. My PhD is in the history of art and architecture, but I've always been a big skier. And we have an amazing mentor named Yakira, who has a PhD in mechanical engineering and design. And one of her proposed projects, because she's also a skier, is actually crafting original skis. So that's something that I would have done. My dad had a wood shop growing up. I would have loved to have actually taken the time to understand the physics and the material behind making my own pair of skis. Whether they would have turned well is a different story, but I think that the exercise would have been really enriching.
Absolutely.
Great. Can we jump into the student questions now? Let me begin with, if I had to choose between writing a research paper and doing a more creative project, how should I think about choosing? What seems more impressive to admissions officers, or does it not matter?
Well, I think the short answer is it doesn't matter. The longer answer is changing your perspective in terms of what looks good to whom. So the question is specifically phrased, what looks better to admissions officers or what's better in college admissions? I would reframe that question as what matters most to me, because when you think about what matters to college admissions or college admissions readers who you will never meet really or know, the people reading your application, it's sort of a black box once it goes in, that's kind of an externalized way of thinking about it. I think about it as an Instagram way of looking at admissions, you know, with all the filters, like, does this look good? How about now? How about now? And there's not a sense of what is the substance. And what I really advocate for all students is don't think about it from the point of view of what will look good to other people who you will never know. Think about it from, I'm not sure what the opposite of Instagram would be, maybe Medium, where you get to speak your truth in, you know, a way that is more unfiltered and true to you. Think about what is authentic to you, what makes you genuinely excited, what puts you in a space where you could go on for hours about the thing that you're really interested in, because the authenticity is actually what admissions officers are looking for, but it has to come from you. It's a little bit like in Kung Fu Panda when, you know, the panda unrolls the secret scroll and it's a mirror and he's really the secret sauce. That's pretty much what I would advise looking at is, you know, whether it's a research project, whether it's a musical composition, whether it's your own original pair of skis, whether it's a deep dive into your family's immigration from Cuba to Florida to somewhere in the Midwest, eventually to California, it's what makes your heart beat a little faster.
That's wonderful. Our keynote speaker, Professor Chang Rayleigh from Stanford, used a similar term when he was describing some of his writing. If it doesn't quicken the heart, it probably is not as authentic as it might be. Another question, this one from Lily. What is one of the most impressive things you have seen on a resume when working in college admissions?
Okay, this is going to sound profoundly anti-intellectual, but I still remember it because I didn't even know what it was. Somebody under extracurricular activities put their number one activity, again, this was a long time ago, I don't think it's a thing anymore, that they were the world champion in Dance Dance Revolution. And I was like, what even is that? I had to Google it. It turned out not only was it a thing, but it's an extremely competitive thing that takes at least 10,000 hours, you know, to get to the point where you become a world champion in Dance Dance Revolution. And it was clearly, you know, I saw the extracurriculars first, and then I read about it in the students' essays. And it was something that was not particularly cerebral, but the student approached it in a really creative, intellectually exciting way. And I just remember thinking, wow, I just went from here's a thing I've never heard of to how cool is that? I mean, they devoted so much passion and interest and energy to it that to me, it really stood out. I mean, there are a lot of other things that I could probably think about for 2 seconds and name, but that is the one that always sort of springs to top of mind.
That's an amazing story. We have another related question about which extracurriculars stand out the most, but also the flip side, which extracurriculars don't really contribute much?
So I think the ones that don't really contribute much are the ones that people feel the most need to do because everybody else is doing them. So there tend to be kind of the generic joining of clubs that may or may not be meaningful to the student, but there's no way to tell that they were particularly meaningful because there's not really depth of involvement. It either doesn't take a lot of time, or there are not really measurable results or deliverables as a result of that activity. Sometimes the activity is babysitting a younger sibling because both parents are working. Sometimes the activity is creative writing. Sometimes the activity is going to thrift stores and buying clothes and repurposing or upcycling them. So there's not an activity that college admissions are looking for. Again, what they're looking for, I think, is the enthusiasm that the student brings to the activity. So you could have cooking as an activity where part of your, quote unquote, deliverable or project is you develop a super deep interest in molecular gastronomy and try to recreate it, a dish or a project using your own kitchen implements. So your interests, I guess the point I'm trying to make is your interests and their manifestations are probably closer than you think. And they might be in your own kitchen. They might be in your own backyard. They might be in your community past something that you walk by every day that you feel strongly about. I had a student a few years ago who noticed that the community she lived in didn't have sidewalks, and she became interested in why the city didn't have sidewalks and whether it was by design or just it didn't have sidewalks. It turned out that it was built into the city plan to keep out people who did not live in that community. And that led her down a rabbit hole into researching urban planning and segregation in communities and, how communities essentially organize themselves so as to include people or to keep people out. And so again, there's not any one thing. It's the thing that you personally think is really cool. And as long as that thing is not, say, vandalism or torturing your younger sibling by following them around, imitating everything they're saying, honestly, anything is fair game.
That's great. Thank you. We have a question that I think will resonate with lots of students, especially at this particular moment, as we are right around the time when final word about applications is coming out. What advice do you have for someone like me who's stressing out so much about college admissions? What if I don't get into my dream school? Should I go to wherever I'm accepted, or should I take a gap year and try again?
That is an excellent question. And it is a question that's very close to my heart, because as somebody who professionally lives in a world of high stakes college admissions, I have 3 children, none of whom went the traditional college route. And it took me a while to get over that dissonance of, the shoemaker's children are barefoot. Why aren't my children in college or a highly selective college? And this is the, I guess, upside of being old and seasoned by experience, is you realize how little it matters where or even whether you go to college. And I know that the seniors listening to this or watching this are right now so deep in that world that it's almost impossible to not think about it. But the fact is, it feels very urgent and immediate right now, and will feel urgent and immediate until you graduate. And then you will be astonished by how many people go very different directions. Some of them take a gap year, some of them go to college and later transfer. Some of them decide this is all stupid. I'm going to go to community college for 2 years and then transfer into, in California, for example, there's a very direct pipeline from community college to one of the UCs. I would think about it from the point of view of, why does admission to your dream school matter so much? What do you think it will help you accomplish? What is your goal? Is your goal to just be admitted to that school? Or is your goal to be eventually a physician, or somebody who studies US history, or somebody who wants to become an artist, or somebody who is thinking about law school or social justice or politics. If that's your goal, there are about 1 million ways of getting there that do not involve threading the needle on the one school that really stresses you out. And I would make it less about, will they like me, and more about, do I like myself? And one of the things that I wanted to build on that Dr. Laborde pointed out about the skills and experiences and knowledge that you get from doing a project like the students who have beautifully showcased their work have done, those are skills that you get to keep forever. Those are skills you could carry around in a little suitcase for the rest of your life, regardless of where you do or don't go to school. You have that. Your intellectual vitality is yours. Your problem-solving skills are yours. And if you don't get into your dream school, I would slow down and take a deep breath and think about, do the other schools where you were admitted offer what you want intellectually and socially? Sometimes you don't get into your dream school, but your other quote unquote lesser schools may offer not only the intellectual and social experience you want, but sometimes really generous merit scholarships. And that is also saying a lot. I'm going to stop talking because I have many opinions about this, but I'll let you look at the other questions. And
that's immensely helpful, I think. And also resonates with something that we feel strongly about and try to remind students of, is that college is really just the next step of your journey. It's not the end. That admissions letter is not the end of a chapter, so to speak. It's really the beginning of the next step. So keeping your eyes on the horizon to say, there are so many great medical schools I could go to if my long-term goal is really to help people in hospitals, or there are so many great jobs I could have if my long-term goal is to work for a nonprofit. So that's something we definitely try to remind students of through this process as well.
And actually, can I just interject one quick thing
Please.
about medical schools specifically? So there is a really, I think, harmful misconception that in order to get into medical school, which I imagine at least some of the Polygence students might be thinking about, the misconception is you have to get into one of the Ivies or Stanford or MIT in order to be a highly qualified medical student applicant or medical school applicant. I would really strongly suggest to all students that they look at the medical school admit rates from those schools, because those are not always the feeder schools into medical school. And those are sometimes schools that are the hardest to get the 4.0 GPA that you need, or close to 4.0 GPA to be admitted to medical school. And often somebody who goes, for example, to University of Nebraska, just to throw out a name, on a full scholarship and with all kinds of bells and whistles because they really want you there, and who is a superstar there and has access to research opportunities that you might not get at a Stanford or a Brown or a UPenn, will be better positioned for medical school because you don't get a Harvard discount if you have a 3.7 GPA applying to medical school versus 4.0 from, University of Vermont or University of Nebraska. So I would think about the long game too. Do you want to go to a school where you're going to feel like you're holding on by the skin of your teeth? Or do you want to go to a school where you kind of feel like a rock star and you have a good 4 years and then you have a good medical school application experience?
Wow, that is a really powerful filter for students, especially those medical aspiring students to consider. Thank you for that. Our time really grows short, but even though there are a number of great questions here that I would love to be able to dig into, I do want to preserve a moment for you to tell us about your forthcoming book, which in many ways resonates with some of these questions. For example, I'm sure that it answers, at least to some degree, the first question that was asked, which is, what is your biggest tip for college admissions? Could you tell us a little bit about this book and some of the messages it shares?
Absolutely. And actually, it very nicely folds into the question of what is your biggest tip? My biggest tip is be yourself and try to actually enjoy the lead up to the college application process, which I realize is a little bit like saying, try to enjoy your root canal. I'm sure there are great things about it as well, but it really is possible to enjoy it if you don't look at your college list and it gives you stress hives, for example. So I would think about building a college list, first of all, from the bottom up, where you're going to have at least 1 or 2 schools on there that are not only going to admit you, but will admit you with a big rolled out red carpet. Because I think that if your entire college list consists of schools with a single digit GPA, yes, you're going to be chewing your nails and otherwise stressed out. But what my book really gets at is the disjuncture between the expectation that many students and many of their parents bring to this process, that there has to be sort of this ideal definition of success. And that usually involves a very narrow metric of you graduate as the valedictorian of your high school class, which again is very difficult if you have a very deeply talented, 200 or 300 or 400 person class. And then you go to a brand name school and your parents can proudly put that bumper sticker on the back of their car and you have then achieved success. The book is about the downside of that kind of thinking. And there is nothing wrong with having high expectations, but I would try to think about the fact that having a desperate desire to get into MIT or Caltech or Stanford or other extremely hard to get into schools are not a positive distinguishing characteristic in your resume. They don't care that you're desperate to go to the school. There are 40,000 plus other people who are also desperate to go to the school. Try to think of yourself as the kind of person who Stanford or MIT or University of Virginia or University of Vermont or University of Oregon's excellent honors program, the Clark Honors College, that they need more than you need them. And why would they need you so much? Because you're curious, because you're a kind person, because you're passionate about what you're passionate about, because you think about not just your own GPA and your SAT scores and your resume, but about who you are in the world. And ultimately, there's not, when everything shakes out, there's not going to be an enormous difference between whether you graduate from MIT or Harvard or San Jose State with an engineering degree, if you are the kind of person who is passionate about building things or about assistive technology for people with disabilities. There is no law or rule that says you have to go to one of 3 schools in order to help other people. So my biggest tip is try to be yourself and try to do things that bring you joy authentically, that are not geared at the same time toward, but how do I get into this school if I do those things?
It's just a great message. Thank you so much. We are about to kick things back to our wonderful co-founder, Jen and Janos, for a little closing remarks. But before then, there's one more question that I think you probably have a short answer to and a long answer to. So I'll invite you to give the short one. Okay. A student wonders, how would you recommend putting together a list of colleges? Is there a right number of schools? So very briefly, what do you recommend for your students? So
very briefly, I tell everybody about 10, which nobody ever listens, but you can keep it to 15 at the most. And in that 15, I would include at least 6 or 7 that you like, that you're reasonably sure will admit you with your credentials and your numbers. But no more than that, because you will absolutely lose your mind writing supplementary essays.
A great final clear tip to take away. Dr. Smith, Irena, thank you so much for joining us. This has been really edifying for me personally, a fun conversation, and I hope also extremely useful for our students wherever they are in the application process. So with that, I'll say goodbye for us and see you all back at the lobby where Jen and Janos will shortly be giving their concluding remarks.
It was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you. And good luck to everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.